Welcome. I'm Ryan Burgess. This is Micro Giants, our standard biweekly meeting or every other week meeting, fortnightly meeting. And we're with Edgar Martin, who is an entrepreneur and has a former banking background, and John Mills, who's sort of a tech entrepreneur and is kind of in the real estate business today. So a good experienced group. Today we're going to continue on from our last month's last meeting. This is going to be part two. We're creating content for the campaign, and as I mentioned, I didn't know how many parts we're going to have, but it's going to easily be three. As I go through and put this together, it really, it ends up being a lot more than I would expect. You'd think this would be easy, but as I did mention, creating the content is the hardest and probably most important part of all advertising and promotion. So let's go ahead and get started, guys. So what we're going to do here is just briefly, without really reviewing too much. And for those of you who are just doing in on two, go back to one to pick up some of the basic concepts about planning, things you do before you start the content. I think that's the message here. Is there are several things that need to be done if you're going to write the content correctly, if you're going to have the right design. We talked a little bit about a lot about perception, different perceptions that people have. Visually primarily. Of course, people have different perceptions of words too, and we talked about speaking in the right language to your target audience. This is just kind of a reminder to say, well, what are the different inputs to the content message? And of course, it's the market niche and positioning, target prospect profile. Who are the people, the differentiators you might have from your competitors? So each one of these is pretty important. You can't come up with a positioning statement, a marketing positioning statement, until you've gone through some of these things, and we talk about that a lot. So that's in a lot of prior videos, including the part one. And at the point when you have done your targeting, the next point is you should be building a prospect profile. Well, what really does that prospect look like? And there might be several different kinds. We're going to talk about two broad, in a real life example today, two broadly different prospect profiles, even though the market was sort of the same market. But it's important because you want to know the demographic and the psychographic or lifestyle behaviorals of that target. Once that's written down, and you might have 4 or 5 or 6 different sort of profiles, it's actually best to write copy for that particular profile. It's actually best to do images for that particular profile if in fact you can discern differences between them, if they're really great, and sometimes they really are. So that's clearly important. Obviously, if you're going to have a selling approach that is to sell your differentiators, then that's pretty key. What does your competition have? Is it a price issue? Is it a quality issue? What's the overall value, that perceived value that the customer places on your product versus the competitor's product, and all the interplay back and forth. And if you're going to sell differentiators, that in a selling approach, many times it's the differentiators that you sell. And we'll talk about an example there. So each one of these is really key. Knowing the market itself, what your positioning in that market is compared to your competitors, the differentiators, of course, and then really understanding your prospect profile. So let's look forward here just a little bit. So here are just a couple of thoughts. When you're building an aesthetic value, a lot of people say, "Oh, that really doesn't matter," But here's a kind of a point: business preoccupation of strategic planning or defining core competencies and activity-based accounting really does not provide value to the customer according to this point of view. I don't really disagree with it, because really the point here is that in a world where most customers have everything that they need, in a market where that's the case, then you need to focus on satisfying customers' experiential needs or their emotional needs. In other words, it's an aesthetic offering at some point. That's mostly business to consumer attitude, because as we talked about last time, B2B many times is really kind of hardcore. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the B2B business today. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Aristotle was the very first one who we know of can be attributed to that. And it's interesting, because the truth is the eye of the beholder can really be quite strange and different. This is Salvador Dali, and as you might be able to figure out, this is a self-portrait. Pretty cool, but his entire persona, his entire presentation was in this sort of weirdo kind of category, where he did a lot of things differently, and he dressed differently. He had this strange pencil mustache. He drove weird cars. He just did, his whole life was different, and that was sort of part of his marketing shtick too. Not only was his art really out there, but he knew how to sell that. He was terribly successful, and after his death, he was copied, and fake copies of his stuff were sold everywhere, because it was so valuable and very much in demand. So there were a lot of people who tried to copy it. So an example of kind of an out there. Whoa, I'm sorry about that. This is from very, very old slides. I tried to take all the sound out. This is a guy who is well respected. He says the organization is not seen as only a product and profit creator, but a culture creator. And I think we all know and understand that a little bit. Oh my gosh, that's bad. The organizations that can synthesize these spheres really will have the edge, and I think that's still right today. So really, when we're talking about characteristics of an organization or brand, what ones should they be? What are we going to try and portray? Where can a set of themes be found? What themes are we going to use? Can we make them look and feel rich in this particular case, not meaning money, but meaning robust to the audience, to the profiles that we're trying to appeal to, and then how should they be represented to express the corporate brand? So that kind of brings us up to branding a little bit. So here's one study. Now, there are lots of people who do lots of studies. There are a lot of opinions, because as we get into this sort of softer side of the softer side of customers' perception, yes, there's science involved. We do have some science, but by the same token, a lot of it is opinion. But here happens to be a particular study that was done some time ago. These things don't change a lot, though. But basically, here's what the outcome was. Some interesting things to think about. Customers prefer elaborate logos over simple ones. Now, that's interesting, because a lot of design teachers will say, keep it simple. Now, that's not what customers say that they want. They like logos that evoke clear associations. In other words, they understand them. They don't want to spend a lot of time. So you're talking about, well, they like a little bit of detail in it, but they also want to know and understand what it's about. They like natural logos. By natural, we're really talking about curvilinear things, shapes that are in nature, as opposed to, maybe hard and rigid. They liked symmetrical logos, and they did not like sharp edges or points. In other words, if you're going to build a logo, you want to stay away from, hard triangles, even though that might feel like that's different. but that tends to be a little bit off-putting to some people. As a result, this particular logo down below was developed based on this research and research of customers, and you can see that it's curvilinear, it's reasonably speaking equidistant, it's straightforward, it says exactly what it's about. People know and understand what it is. And at the same time, it shows a local icon that happens to be Long's Peak, and Longmont was named for Long's Peak. And it's got a little bit of nature, and it could be a field, it could be cows out there. So the whole thing was, let's develop something that is new and fresh and different. Now, this was new and fresh and different 30 years ago. It has been updated because it felt just a little cluttered and clunky. So, but I'm just talking about how did we end up going here? The point is, we didn't just start drawing. We thought clearly about who our customers were. We knew what their profile was. We looked at the studies, and we came up. We allowed that governance to help the designers put together something that has really served extremely well. We know what the competition's logos were. Most of the competition that was there 30 years ago is gone. So our success has been pretty much evident here. Not saying it's the logo, but at the association and understanding of what people expected was clearly pervade here and had been for years. So bring forward a couple of ideas. The number one biggest recognized logo in the world has been Coca-Cola. So, I mean, take a look at it. Even though it's in kind of a square, you might say, oh, that's kind of hard edges, but take a look at the curvilinear nature of Coca-Cola. This is a logo that goes back to the 1890s, and yet they still continue to do it. Now, they do have Coke, hard C-O-K-E. That's another one they probably did that based on trying to do something that's a little bit younger, more contemporary for the times. Yet, even though they have that, there's not a lot of messing around with this. You can see this curvilinear kind of natural shape was sort of added later on. It goes along with the C here. We later added a very similar thing to the dairy, and only it was in greens in order to be able to freshen up and give us just a little more substance when we were doing certain kinds of ads. Of course, this one is recognizable. That's Nike. There's an interesting story about how it just was done by one of the people, one of the ladies in the office, and they basically, I think, paid her a little bit of money as a thank you, but it was a company that had two shoes, and it wasn't successful. They didn't know what to do with it. Ultimately, that has turned into a world famous brand. And of course, it does mean something. It's got a lot of action. It feels like it's a little bit sporty. Some people associate it with a Greek, I can't remember which one, with one of the Greek gods, etc. And of course, Starbucks. And you can see these same elements are in all of these ones the things that we've talked about. I mean, they all fit. And here we have, 2, 3 of the top logos in the world, and they all sort of kind of fit. You could argue this isn't very complicated, and I would agree with that. It's not a complicated logo, but it has been it's worked very, very well, obviously, because they put it on all their merchandise and their shoes. So had it been a little more complicated, would it have worked a little better? Don't know. There's still a lot of give and take in these concepts. Things change over time. I think this is sort of an interesting one, because when you take a look at aesthetics, this just really kind of shows what happened to the Betty Crocker. And we're talking about the fake personage that was used from 1936 until 1986, so for 50 years. And every once in a while, they felt like they needed to change it. Well, this is obviously old-fashioned. This looks pretty old-fashioned. I mean, since I've been around this long, that doesn't look so old-fashioned to me, but you can see how they changed the hairstyle. This 72, I don't remember this. That's not what I recall. But anyway, this was supposed to be the ideal woman, in a sense, the sort of standard ideal customer for Betty Crocker. And it just changed. You can see it looks like it kind of got modern here. But what happened after 86? Well, they really were out of step at the time. I mean, it's like, well, what's the deal? Is this like all your customers are like white women? And the answer is, well, of course not. I mean, this is this the market's bigger than this. You can't be restricting yourself. You don't need to have something like this. So they went to this spoon. So you can see that a lot of the same elements are still here. It's still Betty Crocker, but they had to get rid of her face because it really wasn't keeping in step with America or the world. I don't know how big of a brand this is. But recently, and so I went back to update this recently, take a look at this new logo. XO Betty. Pretty interesting. Sort of like Love and Kisses, sort of that kind of thing. And then they've reduced it down to Betty. So over time, they've realized that they had to modernize it and they had to do some things. But when they finally got back to the logo stuff, it still stays pretty basic and pretty simple, even though they did drop the face. It's just a little bit volatile, actually. And I'm a little surprised it took up until probably 1990, 95 for them to really realize that they were kind of not only dating themselves, but they were missing the market quite a bit. So here we have some logos, and you recognize these. They happen to be focused really on food and agriculture, but of course, Sunkist sort of fits. It's very curvilinear. The font is a little bit more complicated than many. Then Dole does the opposite thing here by making it very straightforward, because the word Dole is different than Sunkist. And of course, what they've done is they tried to get the sun in here, make it really simple. Chautauqua, Chiquita is a banana brand, as you know. They've expanded a little bit into some other things, but they've got kind of a complex little piece here. Kind of hard to tell what that is. So when I had a client where we had a problem in the avocado business, what we did in order to begin developing this particular situation here is, well, what are you going to do with the logo? Well, the question is, what are you trying to accomplish? So in this particular case, the number one avocado brand in the United States, probably the world, was called Calavo. And it's pretty, it's a good name. What does it mean? It's, well, California avocado. So it's a good name. And it worked pretty well. The Pro-Ripe was a service that they added later. But these guys were number one. Number two was Mission. So Mission is an interesting name. It doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't say avocados to speak of, but it's just kind of been who they were. Why? California avocados. So they sort of grew out of that. They haven't really added or changed it, but they do have to add avocados, or they've got a picture behind in this particular one. In order to describe what it really is, they do have to add something to that. So then here's another one called Westpac. This is a little teeny company, and while they have the logo here, a little bit of a logo or an image which you can kind of tell is an avocado if you know what company it is. Westpac stood for Western Packaging. So, they just kind of defaulted, well, we'll call ourselves Westpac. There'll be some association from the old and the new, and they'll know who we are and understand. Well, here was a situation. My client you had number one, Calavo, number two, Mission. Together, they had about, which happens very often, they had about 30 to 40% of all the business. Everybody else, another 15 or 20 American avocado packers, had all the rest, so they had to split it up. Westpac and two others were tied for fifth, and they were way behind. So, instead of it being 30%, 20%, 10%, or some sort of a ratio like that in terms of number one, two, and three in the marketplace. It was more like 35%, 25%, and then all five of the others had 10%. So there's a big gap between number three and number two. That's why sort of they were all kind of tied, almost the same volume, tied for fifth. So what our first challenge was is to, and we built a specific strategy, and that strategy was we have to at least look like we're national. We have to look like the other two big guys if we expect to take that number third. And our goal was we got to take the number third spot. Well, here's what we started with. We started with a theme. The company was put together in 1919, and you can tell obviously this is from that earlier than no later than the 20s or the 30s, and it was called Index Supreme. And here's this cute index finger. As try as we might in research it, we couldn't figure out what that meant. So it's like it doesn't mean anything. They were also selling lemons and other things. Now they are only doing avocados. So what in the world do you do? Well, you want to keep the name because this is how they were known throughout the industry, and it's owned by growers. So it's a cooperative, and that it started that way. Then they turned it into a corporation, still owned by growers. Well, so what do you do? And here's what our solution was. So we came up with a name called Avoterra. It was very, very specific. We wanted the Avo in there. Didn't intentionally try and create Calavo, but you know, the Avo is certainly useful for trying to help people understand what's going on. Terra is of the earth, and so it's really avocado of the earth. So that's how we came up with the name. We tested many different variations of that, and then we added by Index Fresh because Index Fresh was the company. The problems were interesting. So the challenge here is how are we going to grow? Of course, it's like we got to grow. The strategy that we developed was we're going to become the number 3 player in the market. Now you might say, why not number 1? And of course, the answer is that, well, because number 1 and number 2 are such big gorillas, there's no way that you could just say we're going to be number 1. I mean, it just was not rational. But to become number 3 meant tripling or quadrupling the business. So there's plenty of room here to be number 3 and let number 1 and 2 just sit. And as you guys remember, is that when we go through and take a look at the PIMS principles, becoming number 1, 2, or 3 in your marketplace gives you an advantage in terms of margins because of the size. And so, you know, that was a big part of why this became the strategy. And of course, I had to sell that concept that this is in fact the case. And it did turn out that. So we worked on this account for about between 8 and 12 years. I can't remember exactly how long, but it was a long time. So we were actually there long enough to see this stuff work. What are we trying to do within the market? What are the characteristics? Well, the interesting thing about this kind of a business is that if you're the distributor, you're the packer, you're in the middle. Somebody's got to grow it and somebody's got to sell it. You're not selling one at a time, you're selling hundreds and hundreds of cases at a time. And so these two markets exist. First, the general food market. Well, those are retail stores throughout the United States. They were in the Southwest. There was a time when avocados were not really known throughout the country. They were mostly in the Southwest, California and the Southwest. That was in my lifetime. I can remember when avocados were in Colorado, which you might count as the Southwest. but they were relatively unknown until Mexican food was being sold on an ongoing basis. We didn't really understand what they were. It was just a new fruit. It was something that has literally been created since the beginning of the 20th century. Their goal was to expand nationally because they needed the volume, and then they also eventually went to Asia as well. So they were able to successfully do this. So that's the market, and it's everybody. What is the buyer like? Well, these are professional buyers that work at grocery stores for national chains, and all they want is the best product they can get for the lowest price that they can get it for. That's pretty straightforward. This is a price deal because you're selling what effectively is a commodity. You can argue there are different kinds of avocados, yes, but the Hass avocado had completely taken over because of its advantages for shipping, for ripening, for color and texture and taste. So that's why there are so many of the avocados that are Hass. Outside of Southern California, I don't know if you can find anything but a Hass. Down in Mexico, you can, of course, but still. So the other thing that they buy is delivery. Avocados, as you know, need to be ripe. You don't want them to be super hard, yet they can't be brown. And so you've got this window, which is only about 8 or 10 days, that you have to develop this. And then what happens is that the stores begin to say, well, we'd like to have them ripened. We want them to be ready to eat in 3 days. And so the industry began to develop a way to develop ripeness that was 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and then hard. That required ripening rooms around the country in order to do that. And there are techniques to get them to ripen faster. In order to be able to get this to work, you have to have a phenomenal trucking and delivery distribution system. And so that had to be, they had to grow into that. And they focused on, when they were focused on the selling market, they were focused on how much margin are they going to be able to provide for the retailer? When will they be able to get them, and how quickly will that happen according to their plan? And of course, by size and then ripeness. But then, wait a minute, that's only half the story. You sold them, but how are you going to get them? In order to be able to make that work, you have to deal with the growers. You have to be able to match the amount of supply with the demand. It's very complicated to do. So when you look at this whole industry of supplying, food, it really is. It's a double-edged sword. So they had two markets, and we had to learn to market to the growers to get the proper supply. At the same time, we had to sell all of those at a margin that would keep this big company in business and give the growers some margin and the sellers some margin. So it's a very complicated thing. They eventually focused on imports. They went to Mexico. They made a lot of the California growers quite upset by this. So there was a matter of convincing the owners and the California growers that bringing them in from Mexico was okay. Again, the growers are driven by price. They want as much as they can get for them, and how fast do you pay us? And so it's pretty straightforward. You know what the quality is going to be, and everybody's competing on the same quality. Basically, it has to do with price and efficiency. And that's why being number 3, being that big, was so critical. So we ended up dealing with this issue in a couple of ways, but we had to focus on growers, customers separately. So we built a website that attacked each one. And as you can see, that we did hundreds of ads over the time period. But you can see that we focused on margins. Appealing margins, obviously, that's the skin being peeled off with money underneath. And then, of course, out of this world with the avocado and the world being the pit. So, I mean, we tried to do creative stuff, but this whole thing was all in the context of what are we trying to achieve and how do we have to achieve it? The looking like the big guys meant we had to have, at very low budgets, we had to have ads that looked professional. They had to look like we were big enough to be able to afford a big agency. And of course, they didn't have a big agency. They just had us, so our little 12-person team was doing what, I don't know how big the agencies were, but, trying to do the same work that the big guys were. But we still had to do something for the growers. If you have nothing but price and how fast you can pay, you got to do something. And so our strategy was to, and I'm sorry that this image is so bad. I was taking it through glass, but we decided to do grower support, and we had a whole grower support strategy. So this is a calendar, and it was dealing with pests. You can see how long ago it was, 2008 and 9. And we did about 6 or 7 of these calendars. So the calendar had what you're supposed to do in the field at a certain time, but it also had incredible photographs of a certain pest, of a certain remedy, and of course directions on how to do that. And then we did it in several different styles over years. And then this one here was a calendar notepad that had the whole story about who we were. So this was built to introduce us to a new grower. This particular piece was actually an easel stand. And so you would take the top piece and fold it over, and then you would show it before computers. Well, there were computers, but nobody really had the audacity to go to a farmer and pull a computer out for a presentation. The sales guys said, no way. Nowadays, that's all changed. But basically what this did was a flip chart. And so we just walked through the story, made sure that each of the salespeople had a sequential way to tell the story for Index Fresh to convince them, number one, we're as big as the other guys, we're as good as the other guys. Number two, number three, that our delivery systems, our payment systems, and our pricing will be competitive with everybody else and will be more consistent than everybody else. How and why? Because we have a better presentation, we have a better set of graphics to tell a story, the visual story, and the perception was, well, maybe we should give these guys a shot. So it was very successful in attracting new growers as the business grew. And it was a constant battle of trying to keep the grower size balanced with the customer size. So here's another one. We're going to completely switch gears here. And that is the introduction against a big challenger. People in the old-fashioned world of vodka knew there was only one serious vodka, and that was Smirnoff. And here's Smirnoff, and you can see, and so the question is, well, can they be challenged? Well, the answer is, yeah, they were challenged. And these slides may not be working exactly the right way, but Absolute Vodka decided to give it a shot. And the question was, wait a minute, you guys are Swedish. What are you guys doing trying to build vodka, which we know has to be made in Russia? Well, basically what they discovered is we can do something entirely different and create an overall customer impression that completely differentiates us from everybody else. And you can see how dramatic that was. And so oh, and by the way, switching products is something that customers do based on packaging. And so you can see that 36% say that they actually switched products. 43% actually use a product more regularly if the packaging has been done. And I think about 55% would actually switch to a new product, purchased a new product based on packaging. So packaging is an important part as well. So what Smirnoff was able, or what, excuse me, what Absolute was able to do was to go against an old standard and completely upend them with nothing but design. So anybody that says, "Oh, design doesn't matter," it's like, okay, well, how do you possibly explain this? And the answer is, design does have something to do with it, even if the product is made in the country that where it's not supposed to be made. So Absolute Vodka was so successful, they actually forced Smirnoff to update their bottles. So it's kind of a fun example to see that, this whole idea of design and positioning really does matter. So that's our example for today, and let's throw it out and see if you have any questions, comments, just chat about some of these issues. Edgar, you're a designer, and so I know you have some opinions about this.
Oh man, well, I'm always dealing with what do you call it? It's easier to help someone else build a logo, right? Um, in the beginning, but then eventually, one thing that helped is to tell customers typically they just start with version one. I was seeing the evolution of the logos, and it kind of makes me feel a little bit happier to see that it's eventually your reputation, whatever you do for a business, in the beginning might be more not beginning. I think it's more important regardless. And eventually the logo will grow within your business. That's one of the things that I personally learned. I don't know this presentation when I saw the evolutions of these logos. And now I live longer in this earth to realize that the logos that I remember when I was a child don't look the same anymore.
Yeah.
So back then when I was younger, every logo was like, why would you change your logo? And now it's starting to make more sense. But
Yeah.
another thing that I wanted to add is I'm dealing with an identity crisis myself for the last 3 years. I'm not gonna lie, I think I bought like over 50, 70 domains in the process of trying to find a brand that I like for myself.
Yeah.
And the process of that has been pretty intensive. Like so I chose to ignore the logo, ignore the business name. And my business, I was able to do that, to go out and just build a business. And the business itself was gonna eventually help me build a name. Right now, my name is my business when I go out and talk to people, but eventually I've been working on trying to figure it out a logo. So when you were showing me this, it was kind of hitting home because I was literally like dealing with this just a few days ago of finding a name that I truly like. And on my name, I added a few things, Edgar Martin and some of the names I was playing with, but just to kind of give you a feeling on the design process, I don't know, it feels like it's going to be almost like your name birth, and so you have to make sure you got it right. I don't
Well,
know.
it helps. I think, yeah, I think it can be a detriment if it's really bad. And there are those that are tough. There's what's the name? You see, it'll be this. This will show you when it's not helpful. There's a prominent advertiser in the air conditioning space that their name is so tough that I can't remember it. And of course, in the ad, they say it's hard to spell, and then they spell it, or hard to pronounce it, but and hard to spell. But you can always remember that we care about you first, and et cetera. So it's sort of like, okay, you admit that it's really tough. You've tried to overcome that because you think that there's a certain value there, and maybe there is, with existing customers. Yet it's so bad that here I am in the profession, and because I have been looking for HVAC guys to come and look at my systems, I'm paying attention. I still can't remember the name. So recall is like just a few percent. And when you're doing radio advertising, if you can't manage to get recall, you completely failed. So so it's a big part. So it shows both they've tried to overcome a bad name, but they still haven't overcome that bad name. Maybe their logo's better. I haven't seen it. But then on the other hand, I think there are those names that really are better that catch on. Nike is a name that was going against some very standard companies. Converse was around, and Puma was around, and three or four other main companies. And they were all kind of names like, Puma. That makes you understand that. I mean, if you know what a Puma is, you know it's going to be
Hmm.
quick and fleet of foot, and that's a good name for a shoe. Well, so what's Nike about? Well, it's the god of speed or whatever, but it was okay, and it was simple, and so they could put it on shoes. And the point is, they didn't know what they were doing, and they had no idea. It just happened to be okay. But then there are other people who know exactly what they're doing, and they come up with names that can be very beneficial. Just as there are companies that just call themselves Smith Brothers, and they manage to come up with cough drops, and it's like it's okay, because they spend advertising money to make you understand what they do.
Another thing that's interesting, bringing it up based on thinking of this, is the words. A lot of the time, I try to, if I choose a word that sounds nice or good, I try to define it on, wait, okay, well, I like this for the name. Let me look at it up on a dictionary. Let me look it up on urban dictionaries.
Right.
Let me look it up in a Mexican or Spanish language. If it's my audience is a different demographic. And then let me look at another side of the world in case that means something completely that I had no idea. I
Right.
don't know if that's actually a good or bad concept, but I'm not going to grow to be worldwide, but still, I just don't want my name to mean something completely, I don't know,
Well,
offensive, I guess.
but you are worldwide today. We are all worldwide with the internet, and so you're wise to be able to do that. And I think that's a part of it. Now, the thing is, though, is it's like kind of an issue of cost. Even though the avocado company wasn't a giant company at the time, they were big enough to be able to afford us to do some things, and we went through all those exercises. When we looked at various names, part of the exercise was doing searches on every one of them, trying to determine exactly how much competition there was on Avoterra. We chose a word that had zero competition in the entire world. So, when we named Red Fusion, we had zero competition in the entire world. So, was that useful? Well, online was absolutely useful, because if we could get name recognition to work, we knew that they could always find us. We knew that if we could get Avoterra to work, then they could always find us. So you look up index fresh, index anything. It's like, what is that? That's an absurd word. It's an absurd name. And I was fortunately able to convince them that they had to move away from that, because it just doesn't mean anything to anybody. And online, there are every kind of index in the world that has nothing to do with avocados. And so we were able to breach that by rebranding and renaming that. So you end up with sort of, you've got to weigh all of these different pieces and try and decide where you can fit in. When you can create a unique name that is understandable, and I think that is a good name. That's perhaps one of the best branding names we've ever done. Avoterra is a great brand, and it worked really, really well, which we proved over years, because they did in fact get to number 3, strong number 3. And I think we outmarketed them, and the big guys were so set in their ways, and the agriculture business is not exactly progressive anyway. We basically caught them with their pants down. They didn't know what happened, because all of a sudden this company starts doing business, and eventually, of course, they did, because they were getting beat at the buyer level. The grocery store buyers were saying, "Sorry, we bought from this other company," and they're going, "Who are these guys? These just got little teeny guys. Why are you buying from them? They can't supply." Well, they were able to. So all I had to do is perform. Here's the price, here's the performance. Yeah, I guess we can switch. You're now competing with these little teeny guys. So I mean, and that's kind of the way that rolled. It worked really well. And there are lots of other examples. The reason to spend a little time and think this through is partially monetary. If you can get found, you've got an advantage, say on the internet. If people can remember your name, you've got an advantage. So those are two advantages that turn into money over the long period of time. And therefore, it is worthwhile to spend a little bit of time doing this. By the way, when we went to Japan, we did a lot of research on international words to determine if there was anything offensive to Japanese and several other countries, the best we could, just to make sure that we didn't do the classic Nova experience that we've talked about, that I guess it was Chevrolet did
Nova.
in Mexico, because as you know, Nova means doesn't go in Spanish.
Oh yeah, and if you give the Mexican culture an opportunity to make fun of anything that it's you know worthy of making fun of, we're gonna find it.
Yeah,
We're gonna look
okay.
for it.
Yeah, well, obviously Mexicans decided they didn't like it because they had to withdraw the car. They couldn't sell any in Mexico.
So I mean, I'll share something that I found, and I think I ran it by accident, but this is why I haven't chosen a logo yet, because I wanted a perfect one, and I'm 50% there. But as you know, Collaborative Networks is the legal name that I have, Collaborative Networks Incorporated.
Sure.
We can't put that on a short name or in an email. I love that name, what it means a lot, but I was been searching for a way how to shorten it.
Yeah.
And so I found the word red based on translation that it meant network in Spanish. Like, oh yeah, well, that's a good way to shorten it down.
Yeah.
And then collaboration is such a difficult word to spell in both languages, but it's somewhat understandable.
Yeah.
And so I just been searching and searching. So finally I came up with, this is actually what I came up with the last couple of weeks or days, is Rede Network, which in Spanish is just add an extra E next to red.
Mhm.
But it meant the word read in English, not like reading, but read. I had no idea existed as an actual word in the dictionary, and it was means to advise.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so it just accidentally came, and I fell in love with the word read in English because of my audiences in the United States. They're all, Mexican or Latinos. So I fell in love with the word read, or in Spanish, rede, which is simpler read, and it has meaning in both languages.
Right. Yeah. That's
And then a network. So I have the two words I want, network and network, in Spanish and English, with the meaning just by adding the E in the middle.
Yeah.
And the E has a lot of meaning to me because it's my initial.
So, oh, okay. Okay.
So I was so excited. Yeah. So that's what I came up with, and that's the one I like the most out of like 8 different versions with the word read in front of it.
Yeah.
But the most important part is when I Googled it, like you said, I had zero competition out there for what I do.
Right.
Red Network in GoDaddy was a $50,000 domain.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Adding the extra E is a $2 domain.
Wow.
And it had more meaning with the E than without the E. So just give you an idea of like all the research I've been trying to do to come up with the name. We're looking at, I would say 3 years of just coming up with the name. But read was my favorite word so far.
So the when you're thinking about actually building it into a graphic, making the E large or unusual would be a way to help people understand, to remember that, oh yes, there's an E in it. It's not Red Network. Or it's not Read Network.
Or Read Network, like reading. Yeah.
Yeah. Or Read D Network. It's red with an E in the middle. And that way the people remember that E, hopefully, and be able to spell it right and actually get you. So I mean, I think that's
yes. So I mean, that was my experience recently, and that was just kind of something I wanted to share based on all the research. And
let me say for the audience that your marketplace includes Spanish-speaking business owners, and so you're working with restaurants who have Mexican restaurants mostly, but also speak Spanish, and so therefore this discussion has a little bit more meaning because you're actually trying to sort of breach the language issues and appeal to both cultures. And so that's exactly right. And it's a great example of, what I was trying to sort of set up at the beginning. You've got to take a look at the market and the niches and the differentiators. All those have to come together. You can't always do it perfect, but the closer, the more of those problems you solve, the better that name ends up being. Yeah.
Mhm.
And of course, it's
So
not just about the name. It also has to do with the perception of the shapes, and as we talked about last time. So, John, you've got an interesting name for your business. You need to unmute, John.
I do have. However, I wanted to bring up one of the biggest controversies that I've been aware of, and it's concerning this. And
New Zealand. Are
well,
you reading that?
actually, what you see is the silver fern.
Oh, okay.
And so it probably didn't catch your attention. But New Zealand as a country had a very large debate, and it's still kind of ongoing, about the flag. And it's when do we change the branding of the country? And the country flag has a Union Jack on it with some stars. And it was believed that we've really no longer really associated to the value that the Union Jack gave in the original formation of New Zealand.
Yeah.
So a lot of people said, hey, it's time to change.
No.
And so a lot of people came out, and there were millions of dollars probably spent, and it went up to government and polls, and it became an item of a very vibrant discussion. And so the Union Jack was going to be replaced by the silver fern.
Oh, wow.
If you look at New Zealand flag identity, you'll have your Google browser filled with a page of alternative branding solutions. And now by default, the silver fern has become a default flag. I don't know whether it's a legal flag, but
Yeah.
it's been readily accepted as people will put it on their batches or their boats or whatever as an indication that they're a contemporary Kiwi.
Yeah.
So part of my dialogue with you would be, when is it time to take a really well-known brand and update it and change it? And by the way, are we liable to ruin it in the process with maybe going from something that's good but not the best to something that's
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is an interesting thing. It's very difficult to make a name change like that, and it costs a lot of money. So when a country's doing it, yeah, millions is right, and there'll be millions and millions more before people understand it. I'm not sure if it matters. I mean, this is kind of a political matter more than anything, but is it going to affect trade? Who's the audience? Are people not going to be, say, visitors? Tourism is big in New Zealand. Are people not going to visit because the Union Jack is no longer part of the flag? I doubt that. It's like New Zealand can kind of stand on its own. That's probably what the logo change is all about. It's like, well, we're who we are. We're not really, we don't really want to be tied to the Anglosphere anymore or whatever. There was a time, I'm sure, when being part of the Commonwealth was advantageous for trade, and so I can see why that might have been important at one time. But things are certainly changing. So it's tough to know. And if you have a business that when you kind of know that when your customers are no longer relating to the logo. And so the question would be, well, who are the customers? Are they citizens? Are they, is this political? Are they tourists? And by putting a silver fern on anything, it's going to be years and years and years and lots of money before people begin to associate that fern with traveling to New Zealand. So it's a big deal. And changing it could end up theoretically costing or actually costing business, because they look at it and they're looking for New Zealand and they don't think they found it because I got this image of something and nobody knows it's a silver fern. It's like, my goodness, why could you make it more abstract? Not really, even though it's an actual version of something. It's like, what the heck is that? So whoever's thinking silver fern is too close to the situation from a marketing perspective, because that's not going to market New Zealand at all until a lot of money is spent creating the association between the country, between travel, and that.
And in defense, so says an American who lives 6,000 to 11,000 miles away from New Zealand.
Well,
So-
but who's your travel customer? It's
No,
me.
I understand that. So
Yeah, that's
all
me.
of us who've lived in New Zealand, we associate the silver fern as to being almost as synonymous as the kiwi.
Well, okay,
And so,
but
yeah,
why not a kiwi, which I think is known worldwide?
no argument.
Yeah. See, so I mean, if you're doing it for political reasons, like, okay, whatever, I mean, you're trying to satisfy voters or something. But if you're actually doing it because you want to affect business in some way, you got to pay attention to your audience way more than
If you want to
whoever
look
you got to
at
do.
branding and curvilinear and identity, pull up the New Zealand Flag Consideration Project. And there's a list of 30 flags that were considered, and I would say 99% of them are curvilinear. And it's really interesting to see the work that's gone into them
Right.
in an attempt. And these were all the ones that made it through I don't know how many 100,000 of
Yeah,
suggestions.
yeah. I'm sure every designer in the country was
Oh,
probably.
every designer had one in. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it does kind of show, and with enough time and effort, any logo can actually be meaningful. But the question really is, well, what about the new customers? For instance, the Kia. Have you noticed the new logo in the back of a Kia? Wow. Oh man, I mean, they didn't change the name, but boy, they changed the perception because it's so contemporary and so modern. And the first thing you look at is, well, I'm not exactly sure what that means. And I remember staring at it the first time thinking, I have never seen a car like, what is this thing? And then just
Yeah.
sitting there, fortunately, as a stoplight, there was enough time. And then it just hit me. Oh my goodness, that's actually Kia. Now I can't get the name erased from my visual memory. When I see that, I know what that is so instantly. That is a good name change, or it's a logo change. But they didn't change the name. Now you're not changing New Zealand, you're not changing the name, but the logo is immediately associated with the name in that because the name and the image are in fact the same thing. So you see, combining them together has some benefits.
Another thing that Kia, right, has a logo that has no letters on it. It's an icon, and essentially is the two letters, right?
Yeah.
And so often I see the full spelled out name like Verizon, and then within the logo an icon that they can go on separately
Right.
and create it on it. So in that case, I mean, what would you recommend to be kind of like two letters? Could it be an icon or based on the meaning of it? Like I struggle a lot with trying to build a logo sometimes based on that.
Yeah. Well, I always like the idea of having what we call a bug. I mean, you've got a name and it could be a long name, but you've got to shorten it somehow because there are lots of things that you want to use just a teeny image for, as you mentioned. And sometimes it can be built, and I think it's best if it's built in the logo somehow or within the font somehow, so that when you see the whole thing out, you kind of know what that is. But today, with I mean, everywhere you go, you have to reduce it down to a little teeny circle for all kinds of things, mostly online, and you get your face on your social media deal and it's got a circle around it. So I mean, so you need something that can be in a smaller space. Also, readability, we haven't talked about this very much, but readability is a key issue. And I always use the example of a guy who, John knows him, I think the company's still around, who's Stewart Real Estate, but it's just a name. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean much. I mean, I know both of us know the owner, but that particular logo, I know they spent a lot of time and effort on because they wanted to know how recognizable it was traveling in a car at 60 miles an hour down the highway. Why? Because they're in the real estate business and they want people to recognize and remember who to call on an available building. So it was very important, and I believe the number was $60,000 that they spent on the studies. We were having this discussion. We're sitting at lunch at Caprice in downtown Redlands. which is the building that my office was in, and Alster owned the building. We're sitting there at lunch, and I'm talking about it and thinking, he's asking me about design and that sort of thing, and what about a name, and how should he, all the things we're talking about. And he said, he pulled out his card and laid it down. He said, "What do you think for $60,000?" Well, and of course, the average person will go, "Well, I could do it for less." And I think I said I would have done it for 50,000. And and of course, I knew what he was doing, even though that was a long time ago and I was much less experienced in the business. But I knew what he was doing, and it's the research that he paid for. It wasn't the design. So, you do it one way, another way, big to little, right to left, whatever, and you test it and you find out what really works. So ultimately, and I guess what I really want to portray here and get across is that ultimately all of those inputs are important, including how fast you can read a logo at 60 miles an hour. You see, they're all important. And how do you know that that's more important than something else? Because you factored in who your audience is. And in this particular case, your audience is a guy who's looking at the building going down the highway, and he goes, "Oh, wait, I'm looking for a warehouse," or "My buddy's looking for a warehouse." And so I need to remember who that was instead of going around the block and trying to figure it out, So, and of course, the phone number was very large on those signs. So he was hoping that people would remember the phone number. But if you couldn't remember that, you might remember Stewart Real Estate, So that's an important thing. And people in real estate business believe that that's a key issue in order to be able to get, those extra few listings or those extra few buyers. And I think we do know that those things are influential in certain circumstances. So the question is, what are the important issues for each name, in each business, in each niche, and what does the customer think about each one of those? Yeah. So I think that's our point for today, and probably a pretty good place to stop. So thank you very much, gentlemen, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Awesome.